Okay, so today we're looking at Tolstoy's great novella, The Death of Ivan Ilych, and with it, something rather different than we have looked at thus far, and dealing with one of the great themes of literature and of philosophy and of ethics, and something about which the Bible speaks a great deal of, which is the not only the topic of death, but the way in which we consider life as a consequence of that. And largely it's dealt with in wisdom literature. And there are a variety of forms of wisdom literature in Scripture. If you don't know, we get Proverbs, we get Ecclesiastes, we get the book of Job. We have all sorts of different smaller variations on that. But all these approaches to death tend to deal with slightly different aspects of death. So the book of Job deals with the meaning and problem of suffering. How do we engage with it? Ecclesiastes deals with the vanity of human life in many ways. Proverbs presents wisdom to us in the form of an encounter between two women, one being a lady personified wisdom and the other a sort of an adulteress that's leading the young man astray. In the death of Ivan Ilych, we're meeting with death. It's not the first time we've met with death on the course. The first time, if you recall, was when we read Everyman last semester as a play. You remember that, Everyman? And one of the characters was death personified, inviting, and it began with death being an instrument of God's providence and calling every man to die. That's not how we're going to meet with with death here. And in that, if you want to think back to how it was presented last semester, death there was something that was going to happen, but had not yet happened. So every man was greeted by death. Death summoned every man. Okay, God has told me to bring you with me right now. And every man says, oh no, I'm not ready. Can I have a bit longer? I wasn't prepared for this. This is too sudden. If you gave me more time, etc. And then there's a whole description of every man trying to fix his own life to be ready to go with death. So death gave him a reprieve, and this was a way for the dramatist to teach us how to live a good life in the awareness that death is inevitable. And so really it was not about death so much as what it means to live a good life, which is one of the themes that comes from death. In the light of the inevitability of death, how are you going to live your life in a full and worthy fashion? Particularly since death is sent by God, and God is moral in his nature and will hold you accountable for the way you've lived your life. So those are the presuppositions of death in the Everyman story. Here we find death presented in a very different way. And it's not something that comes at the end of the story, it's how the story begins. It begins with the death of Ivan Ilych. He's dead when the story begins. And so if you compared the two approaches, you would see that they're very differently handled. And they can be very differently handled. And here we have something along the lines of what you will find in criminal dramas and so forth, which often, if you think of like the CSI type programs, I don't watch them much myself, but they usually begin with a murder at the beginning and the character's dead. And then there's a backtracking to how we got to the point where the character has been murdered and the suggestions of how it could have gone differently, and then the attempt to find the perpetrator of the crime, etc., all that sort of stuff. That's not Illich's, or rather Tolstoy's interest here. He has no interest in that per se. It's not who's responsible for the death. It's the metaphysical fact of death that is Tolstoy's interest and is of a perennial human interest. What is it about death that so preoccupies and interests people in the living of their lives that they will deny that it is something that's going to happen to them, and when it happens, they're surprised and appalled. And you've probably already experienced this in your young lives, that death has been talked about more in your generation than it was in any previous generation because of the whole COVID scare nonsense, which created the fear of death all around us, even though not many people were actually dying from it, but it was certainly presented as a real imminent threat, and made us think about that and fear the possibility of it, even though when most people are your age, dying is not usually of natural causes. Even a sickness is not something that usually happens. It's unusual when you reach your late teens that you're going to die of some physical cause. Or if you do, it'll be an accident. And there, it wasn't for the last couple of years. It was presented as, well, you know, there's some unseen thing that could bring you down. So it's been brought to the attention of people in a way in my lifetime that's unprecedented, but not for you. And you're younger than me, so your terms of experience are a lot shorter. And that might be a good thing for you, actually, quite frankly, because it's made you more philosophically minded, more wise, because you're facing something that every generation throughout the human history has had to face, largely because human life was subject to death, like sickness and death. When you got sick, you could die. Medicine had not developed to the point where they understood things like, you know, bacteria and viruses and so forth. When people got sick, they might die. In fact, I think in Calvin's Geneva, it was considered a matter of church discipline if you didn't call the elders and you were sick for more than 2 days to pray for you, because it might lead to death and you needed to be prepared for the situation and so forth. And of course, death had meaning then. It was the cessation of your bodily life, but it also meant that you were going to meet the source of life, God himself. And is your soul prepared for that fact? Do you have faith in the Lord of life and so forth? There's all sorts of implications of death that bring not just the end of a person's bodily existence, but there's a spiritual aspect to it. Now, the death of Ivan Ilych touches upon those themes without being explicitly Christian. And in fact, I don't think Tolstoy ever was a Christian. But he raises topics, and I think it's a masterpiece in its rendering of the problems of life and death, and in particular of death. And in many ways, it raises some of the problems that I think rise in the Enlightenment period. We've already seen this also, if you think back a few weeks ago, when we looked at Jonathan Swift's The Modest Proposal, about the way in which the modern Enlightenment looks at human life and rationalizes it and tries to manage it and control it to extend it and make it more productive, and uses science to do that and measures it and talks about productivity and can give graphs and statistics to measure it. In fact, on that front, did you know that there's something called a countdown calculator that insurance companies use? You heard of this before? A countdown, I'll tell you what it is. A countdown calculator is something that they use. You probably don't have insurance yet, or if you do, you're being covered by your parents or something like that. But when you do, they give you a health exam and they do a background history on you as an individual. They look at all sorts of things, among others. How long did your parents live? Did they have any illnesses? How about their parents? Where do you live? Is it in an area where you're more likely to suffer, you'd be shot? Or is it a drug area? And is there all sorts of what we call environmental factors that would affect the possibility of your quality of life? Because if your quality of life is stressful, then it's more likely that you'll succumb to disease, et cetera, et cetera. They factor all of those things in, and they will then give a date where they think you're going to die. and they will make money on whether they have got it on the right side or not. It's a very brutal process. That's how you make money as an insurance company. The person dies after this period. If they die before, then you got to pay out. So here's the date, and then your rates go up after that, because you've already reached the point where they expected you to have died. So if you live beyond that, it's a different thing. Now, what that is doing is quantifying and putting a financial incentive behind giving you insurance, etc. The reason I'm simply saying this is that most people don't think they're going to die, and the insurance companies don't think you're going to die until you reach that age. And what that does is it makes death into something that seems very abstract and distant from us, something that we can bet on, and something that we can insure ourselves against. But it comes one way or the other, and that's the perfect statistic, by the way. Every person who's ever been born will die. And there's only a few exceptions, like Enoch and so forth. But mostly when you live, you're going to die. That's 100% certain. It's when you will is another matter. But what Ivan Ilych, and the death of Ivan Illich by Tolstoy, illustrates chiefly, which seems to me to hold true to this very day, is that people don't think they're going to die. And it's more to the point they don't want to think that they're going to die. And their desire not to think about the fact they're going to die is so strong that they will do anything rather than think about the fact that they're going to die, even though it will come. And they are going to face consequences of that fact. And it's not just the consequence that they'll be dead, but all of everything that makes them will cease to be them. Or will it? Well, it depends on your understanding of your life, whether that will extend beyond the grave, etc. All of those issues that are interrelated to our life and our death are presented in the death of Ivan Illich. Yes?
Around when does this take place?
So this is written in the late, what is the date for it? It's in the 1880s. So it's the late 19th century. Written in 19th century Russia. That's the context in Moscow. Primary landscape. And Ivan dies of a terminal illness, which comes upon him suddenly. It's actually not entirely clear what's the cause of his demise. He does fall from a ladder, hurts his side, but it doesn't seem like it. So maybe it's internal bleeding, whatever. It's not clear. I think at first when he falls, it's not obvious that he's going to die from this fall. It's not expected that he will. And then he doesn't get better. And then, in fact, he gets worse and worse and worse and worse. But what is really interesting about the story is how the characters, and these include Ivan, does not want to think about anyone's death having a connection to them dying. And their only way of engaging in it is thinking how it will benefit them if somebody else dies. I don't want to think about mom and dad dying, but I will stand to inherit this, that. So I actually like that thought. There's stuff, there's money or whatever. I'll think about the positive side, but you won't actually think about the negative side of it, or you might, but you will apply it to somebody else, but you'll never apply it to something that will happen to you. Ivan spends his life trying to avoid thinking that he will die. And Ivan represents the late 19th century Russian mindset that is similarly committed to not thinking about death, even though it is a perennial aspect of human existence and the subject of every religion and philosophy. So it is a profoundly anti-intellectual age, and we live in the same sort of age. And this was one of my observations during the whole COVID malarkey, is that the reason people were so terrified is they were being forced to think about something that their culture did its level best never to think about. And my illustration of this is when people get sick, they put them in the hospital. And have you actually seen somebody die in front of you? Any of you? No, well then you're not unusual, because in our age we tend not, like people when they're sick, they get them right out of our sight. And the experts look after them, and they go into a room and maybe they don't come out of the room. But we don't actually see them physically expire in front of us. And so death is something that is terrifying, but also we have no acquaintance with it. Most people have also never seen anybody being born. Somebody giving birth, maybe an animal. Most people haven't even seen animals give birth. So the vital aspects of life for a human being, birth and death, we've never actually seen other than on television. But it's not the same thing as seeing it yourself. And it allows people not to think about it, because they don't want to think about it. Because to think about it is to raise all sorts of profound questions about the meaning and purpose of living. Because that is what is implicated in your view of dying, is what is the purpose of my life? How will I live my life if this is what death will entail? And the best you usually get from is the Lion King, The Circle of Life. It's and it's all happy, and it's it just happens to everyone. But there's no sense of the loss of an immortal soul, an individual in front of you that you will never see the like of again. This person will no longer be a part of your life. Is there any sense of that? In culture, there is almost none. Amongst our contemporaries, there's no discussion about this. I can tell you that in some cultures that are much more philosophically minded and intellectual than ours, like Russia, they'll happily talk to you about death. And it's not because they're in a war in Ukraine and so forth. Some cultures are not so afraid of it. North Americans are terrified of it. It's a very sanitized culture, very happy, very consumer-driven, consumption-minded, materialistic, same as Tolstoy's Moscow. This is the rat race where everybody's trying to get as much stuff as they can and rise the ladder of promotion and of titles and of achievement that will help them feel like they are avoiding the very thing they have all in common. From the poorest of them to the richest, because kings die just as beggars do. And kings don't like to think that they're no different than the beggars as far as encountering death, but they are. And one of the great follies that this story will expose is that the higher Ivan climbs, the more foolish he becomes. And the more heartless he is towards the suffering of others. And we will observe one of the effects of his suffering is to make him more compassionate towards others. When we first meet him, it's not when he's dead, but when we first meet him in his early years, he's a man who has no care or compassion for his wife or his kids or anyone around him. Typical young man. But as he himself suffers, he first of all does think about his suffering. He's, oh, poor me, there's a lot of that. But he also is aware of the fact that other people care for him and their suffering, and he actually feels compassion for their terror at what has happened to him for the first time. So he transforms as a character. Now, the way Tolstoy does this so brilliantly is through the construction of his novella. I called it a novella. A novella is a short story. It's not a novel, it's a short novel. And what he does is collapses space and time through the telling of the story. So chapter 1 is Ivan dead. Then the next several chapters deal with the first 40 years of Ivan's life. And the chapters are pretty long. And then an accident happens. And the next 4 chapters deal with 3 weeks of Ivan's life, more or less. And the chapters are shorter. And then the final 4 chapters are dealing with Ivan in the last week of his life. And they're even briefer. And what this does, this construction, this use of narrative, is to give the sense that life is speeding up the faster the closer he gets to death, the quicker life seems to come at him. And most of you are young and you won't know what I'm talking about here entirely, although you'll have some of experience of this right now. When you're young, things seem really slow. Summer is a long time between your grades. Summer goes really long. The older you get, the quicker the summers go. And the years go. And time goes. Now, in terms of measurement, it's the same time. There's no change. But in terms of how you experience the time, it's radically different. Radically different. And so one of the things you get from being older is a sense of perspective. It's like, that's another day. And yes, this is terrible. Yeah, but there'll be another day. You get the wisdom of years that it will allow you to think that, you take day one day at a time and don't worry about tomorrow, which is Jesus' counsel for living the way God wants you to live. Don't worry about tomorrow because tomorrow's got enough worries for you. Deal with things today as they're given to you. Live one day at a time, if you will. It's very difficult to do that when you're young and you suffer an adverse event. It seems catastrophic. I got a bad grade. Oh no. My girlfriend dumped me. Oh no. This is terrible. And you can moan and groan and weep, and it's devastating. It's really funny from the outside. But from the inside, it's interminable suffering. Right? As you get older, it's like, whatever. I didn't like her anyway. Whatever. Not quite that. But it's more, there is a sense of this has happened, and I know that there's another side to that. There's a little bit of wisdom experience. But again, the experience produces a little bit of character. Because suffering produces, a sort of endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, it says, right, in the epistles. But it only produces hope for those who have hope. And they have hope if the outcome of their death is life. Because God himself also suffered and endured suffering, and in the end, his suffering led to his death, but also his resurrection. And faith in the resurrected one gives a means of hope for all those who are suffering, and so forth. But again, it's only if you have faith in the one who rose from the dead that you have hope. Otherwise, suffering does not produce hope. It does produce a bit of patience, and it does produce compassion. So people who have suffered a great deal are very much more inclined to be compassionate to other people. Because they've been there. They know what it is to suffer. Maybe not that, but something sufficiently bad that they understand what suffering is. And that will humanize you, actually. So it's really interesting that suffering is an aspect of human nature that great literature talks about. Philosophy has a great deal of difficulty talking about this topic. Stories and literature deals with it extraordinarily well. And this is a really great illustration of it. Let me just read this, the first chapter here, and I'm going to go through it. I'll see how much I get through today. But it's going to have this structure of the beginning of the death of Ivan Ilych, which is with his death, and then a flashback to the beginnings of his life and how we got there, and then the incident that led him to his death, which is his fall from a ladder, and the fall probably has metaphorical significance. He falls off the ladder of his ambitions, hurts himself, and it's an illness that's going to lead to an event that he never imagined. And everyone who's reading it will think about the consequences of the story for himself or herself. So let me begin here. Oh, by the way, one final thing. In the gospel accounts, which are written about the life of Jesus, right? And so you could call them biographies. There are 4 biographies of Jesus, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The foremost feature of the gospel accounts is that the majority of the accounts are dealing with the last week of Jesus' life. In other words, the events leading up to his death and the meaning and significance of his death. This is a very strange biography. Because if you read anybody else's biography, the death of the person comes at the very end of it, and there might be a little discussion about the legacy of the person. It might be a brief chapter or something. You know, this man's life was transformative. But their death is never transformative, by the way. Any biography you read, the death of the person about whom the biography is written is the thing that influences the life of the person, but not their death. Whereas in the gospel accounts, it's the exact opposite. Insofar as it is the meaning of the death of Christ that animates the life of the apostles and of the church. And the symbol of the Christian faith becomes the cross, which is the means of death, not the cradle. Although the virgin birth is crucial to the Christian faith, but it's not the symbol of the Christian faith. It's not the Bible either. The Bible is not the symbol of the Christian faith that the cross is. And it's a symbol of death. Some people have crosses around their necks. It's a death symbol. It's actually also the means of state-sponsored execution. Ever thought about that? You got to meet you. Oh, what an individual you are. You're carrying around what like an electric chair around your neck, or a jab like a needle, and yeah, that's what you got around your neck. It's a state-sponsored mean of execution of people that the state wants gone. That's what you have around your neck. Okay, but so there's a lot of significance to this death that you don't really think about, and the significance of how the gospel accounts change our view of what life and death are. These can be compared and contrasted with this rendering by Tolstoy here. So let me read them. Tolstoy you might know better from War and Peace. That's his most famous work. But this is a great work on itself, in and of itself. So in the big building of the law courts during a break in hearing the case of the Malvinskys, the members and the prosecutor met in Ivan Yegorovich Shebek's office, and the conversation turned to the famous Krasovsky case. Fyodor Vasilievich became heated, demonstrating non-jurisdiction. Ivan Yegorovich stood his ground. As for Peter Ivanovich, not having entered into the argument in the beginning, he took no part in it and was looking through the just delivered Gazette. So he gets the newspaper, opens it up to the obituaries. "Gentlemen," he said, "Ivan Ilych is dead." "Can it be?" "Here, read it," he said to Fyodor Vasilievich, handing him the paper, still smelling of fresh ink. Now, old newspapers used to be, they'd go over the printing press, they'd have the ink on them, and the ink would come off on your hands. Not anymore. But not that long ago it would. That's the case here. So this is literally news. It's just come hot off the press. Inside, a black border was printed. "It is with profound grief that Praskovia Fyodorovna Golovin informs relations," this is his wife, by the way, "relations and acquaintances of the passing away of her beloved husband, Ivan Ilyich Golovin, member of the Court of Law, which took place on the 4th of February of this year, 1882. The funeral will take place on Friday at 1 p.m. Ivan Ilyich had been a colleague of the assembled gentlemen, and they had all liked him. He'd been ill for several weeks. It had been said that his illness was incurable. His post had been kept open for him. But there was an understanding that in the case of his death, Alexeyev might be named to his post. And to Alexeyev's post, either Vinnikov or Stabel. So that on hearing of Ivan Ilych's death, the first thought of each of the gentlemen assembled in the office was of what this death might mean in terms of transfers or promotions of the members themselves or of their acquaintances. First thought, what does this tell us about the characters? They liked Ivan Ilyich. They immediately think to what? So this is the meaning of this man's death. So this is one of the brilliant features of Tolstoy, is he has psychological awareness and gets inside the minds of the characters. You can't see this, especially if they don't say it. And they're not going to say it because it's embarrassing to say this. But are they thinking it? Yes, they are. How does he know that? Because he himself would have thought this way. And recognize this is why they behave the way that they do, because they think this way. So their immediate thoughts are the advantage that comes from this man's death for them. Now I'll probably get Stabel's or Vinnikov's post, thought Fyodor Vasilyevich. It was promised to me long ago, and the promotion means a raise of 800 rubles, plus office expenses. I must now request my brother-in-law's transfer from Kaluga, thought Peter Ivanovich. My wife will be very glad. Now she won't be able to say I've never done anything for her family. Now, let me say something about this. Moscow is a sort of a sovereign jurisdiction within Russia. It's an imperial city. You may not live there without permission. You can come in and work there, but you may not reside there. So this is what is meant by this. You actually have to have permission to live within the city of Moscow. It is the case to this day. There's only certain people that can live within Moscow. You can be there as a tourist, whatever. There's a visa that allows you, but you can't actually stay there the whole time unless you have a permit to stay within the city. And if you're not, then you stay outside the city. And the city is the place where people are trying to be, because that's where the money and the wealth and the power are packed up on one another. So you want to be in Moscow. It's the center of the empire. And so he's thinking about already climbing up the social ladder as well as the financial aspects. I thought he would never get on his feet, Peter Ivanovich said loudly. What a pity. But what exactly did he have? The doctors couldn't determine. That is, they did, but differently. When I saw him the last time, it seemed to me he'd recover. And I haven't visited him since the holidays. I kept meaning to. Did he have any money? It seems his wife has a little something, but quite insignificant. Yes, we'll have to go. They live terribly far away. From you, that is. Everything's far from you. So now we get what between them? The inconvenience of the death of Ivan Ilyich, and for some, an opportunity to boast about how close they are to the center of Moscow, or far away. And therefore, you can look down, you're inferior to me. Yes, for you it is, not for me. So all of this, the characters. And so you get something of a little color here. See, he can't forgive me for living across the river. Now this is the one man's response to the other man's comment. Peter Ivanovich said, smiling at Shebek. He's smiling and loathing him. Hate that. Anyway, smiling at Shebek. And they started talking about the long distances in town and went back to the session. Apart from the reflections this death called up in each of them about the transfers and possible changes at work which might result from it, the very fact of the death of a close acquaintance called up in all those who heard of it, as always, a feeling of joy, that it was he who was dead and not I. Is this realism? I actually think it is. People take a strange, perverse delight in the misfortune of others. Not because they necessarily wanted that person to die, but because it didn't happen to them. So I've experienced in my own life, and I know other people just from experience, when a real hardship affects you, you find that your friends distance themselves from you. Your friends, so your colleagues, nobody wants to talk to you. They say they're giving you space. They don't want you to deal with it. That is how the standard human response to suffering in many ways. When Jesus says that he's going to go to the cross and be crucified, and his friends say, we're going to be with you to the end. We're with you. I will never renounce you. What happens? They all renounce him. They all abandon him. So in addition to the fact that he's going to face his death, he suffers the loss of friendship. And these were genuine friends. And the dereliction that comes with the suffering. One of the worst aspects of grief is that your friends leave you, just like we saw in Everyman. Remember his friends, oh yeah, I'll be with you. I am with you. It doesn't matter who's. And then he said, well, but you're going to death. Well, I'm not going there. If you want to have fun, I'll be with you. And if you want to go into a fight, I'm there. But if it's going to a fight in which you can't possibly win, and I'm going to have to go to, I'm not going there. I'm gone. So this is, again, psychologically acute of Tolstoy. You see, he's dead and I'm not, each one of them thought or felt. Close acquaintances, Ivan Ilyich's so-called friends, involuntarily thought as well that it would now be necessary for them to fulfill the very boring obligations of decency and go to the funeral service and to the widow on a visit of condolence. Closest of all were Fyodor Vasilyevich and Peter Ivanovich. Peter Ivanovich had been Ivan Ilyich's comrade in law school when they were young, undergrad, and considered himself as under obligation to him. He felt a moral obligation to his friend. Having told his wife over dinner the news of Ivan Ilyich's death and his reflections on the possible transfer of his brother-in-law to their district, Peter Ivanovich, without lying down to rest, put on his tailcoat and drove to Ivan Ilyich's. At the entrance to Ivan Ilyich's apartment stood a carriage and 2 cabs. Downstairs in the front hall by the coat rack, leaning against the wall, was a silk brocaded coffin lid with tassels and freshly polished gold braid. 2 ladies in black were taking off their fur coats. One, Ivan Ilyich's sister, he knew. The other was an unknown lady. Peter Ivanovich's colleague, Schwarz, which means black, by the way, in German, was about to come downstairs, and from the topmost step, seeing him enter, stopped and winked at him, as if to say, Ivan Ilyich made a botch of it. We'll do better, you and I. So he's dead, but we're not going to worry about that here. Why? These guys play cards. It's card night. And they're here on card night, and yeah, they got to go through this, but you know what? As soon as there's an opportunity here, I think we can we want to let this interrupt. Cards. The ladies went downstairs. Schwarz, with a playful glance, moved his eyebrows to show Peter Ivanovich to the right, to the dead man's room. Yeah, he's over there. Peter Ivanovich went in, as always happens, with some perplexity about what he was to do there. One thing he did know, that crossing oneself on such occasions never did any harm. So again, something really interesting here. The cross, as I say, is a universal symbol of Christianity. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, one crosses oneself 3 times, in fact, opposite the way the Catholics do. Doesn't matter. But here's a man who knows that there are certain rituals that are performed in and around certain rites. death being one of them, funerals being one. He sees people crossing themselves a lot. So he's going to do this as well, without any awareness of the symbolism or the meaning and significance of the cross and the death that is connoted by the cross. But he's just going through the rituals. He's a cultural Christian, in other words. And that's it. And Tolstoy is suggesting that the people of Moscow are similarly cultural Christians. They are, in one sense, deeply committed to their orthodoxy. On the other hand, it hasn't penetrated their skulls in the way they live their lives. Certainly is the case here. It never did any harm, so we'll just do that. Concerning the need to bow at the same time, he was not quite so sure. And therefore, he chose something in between. Going into the room, he began to cross himself and to bow slightly, as it were. Now, this is a comic portrait. Here's a man that doesn't know what to do in the situation, and so he sort of does half of a little bit of both. And at the same time, insofar as his moving hand and head allowed him, he looked around the room. Two young men, one a schoolboy, nephews apparently were crossing themselves as they left the room. A little old lady stood motionless, and a lady with strangely raised eyebrows was saying something to her in a whisper. A reader in a frock coat, brisk, resolute, was loudly reading something with an expression that precluded all contradiction. The butler's helper, Gerasim, passing in front of Peter Ivanovich with light steps, sprinkled something on the floor. Seeing this, Peter Ivanovich at once sensed a slight smell of decaying corpse. Yeesh. During his last visit with Ivan Ilych, Peter Ivanovich had seen this muzhik in the study. He had performed the duties of a nurse, and Ivan Ilych had especially disliked him. Peter Ivanovich kept crossing himself and bowing slightly in an intermediary direction between the coffin, the reader, and the icons on a table in the corner. Now, the icons in the Eastern Orthodox tradition are portraits of Christ or the Trinity. And I don't know if you've seen icons in the Orthodox tradition. They're not realistic portraits. They're demonstrably a person, but there's something about the person that doesn't look quite right. And you look at the icon, and the icon helps you to some degree think about what lies behind the icon and so forth. I've been told it's considered to be like a portal into heaven. So the icons are there, the people crossing themselves are there, and so there's this scene of orthodox treatments of death in the room and a man who does not even know what any of this means. And the dead men lay as dead men always lie, with a peculiar heaviness. Dead man fashion. There's a good description. What does the dead man look? Like a dead man. Okay. His stiffened limbs sunk into the lining of the coffin, his forever bent head on the pillow, displaying, as dead men always do, his yellow waxen forehead with the hair brushed forward on his sunken temples and his thrust out nose as a pressing down on his upper lip. By the way, most people will not experience this anymore. It used to be very common to have open coffin funerals. Some people still do. Most people are more and more going away from coffins and burials and towards cremation, which is a different issue, and it says something about how we view the body. And that's its own sort of issue, and I don't want to get into that. Some people don't even have a funeral, they have a celebration of life, which just further extends the fact that they can't deal with death and don't want to talk about the death and don't want to act as if that applied to them or would affect them in any particular way, or as if they could reverence the person who's been lost by thinking happy thoughts about the person in their happy seasons of life, but not thinking about the fact that a person of moral significance in their life is no longer going to be a part of their life, and it's devastating. Sometimes what you do disguises what you don't want to think about. And is it a better way of treating the person that's gone to think about only those things and not think about the loss? I've experienced these now. You probably will as well. As our culture gets less and less Christian, you'll be in these weird treatments of the loss of a human life. And people seem to have lost any sense of what they ought to do. So they make it up as well. It's a lot of make it up as you go along, just like they're make it up as you go along weddings now as well. But make it up funerals for sure. And there was on his face the expression that what needed to be done had been done and done rightly. Besides that, there was also in that expression a reproach or a reminder to the living. This reminder seemed out of place to Peter Ivanovich. It's out of place for you to force me to think about the fact that you're dead and that I might be dead. This is not polite of you to remind me of death, dead man. That's offensive. How dare you die and be dead? You can die, just don't force me to think about your death. I like open cast funerals for that reason. Forces people to think about what they refuse to think about. But that's me. And they're awful, by the way. It's pretty awful. Still. Schwartz was waiting for him in the passage, his legs straddled, his hands playing with his top hat behind his back. His top hat behind his back. One glance at Schwartz's playful, clean, and elegant figure refreshed Peter Ivanovich. Peter Ivanovich understood that he, Schwartz, was above it all and would not succumb to depressing impressions. He's not going to get depressed. He's thinking happy thoughts. He's thinking about the card game. His look alone said, the incident of the funeral service for Ivan Ilych could in no way serve as a sufficient motive for considering the order of the session disrupted. And what's the session? Well, it's not a drinking session. It could be, but it's the cards. By the way, the session is in Presbyterian circles, the seating of the elders. They're going to have a session. Well, here the session of cracking a newly unsealed deck of cards that same evening while a valet set up 4 as yet unlit candles. In general, there were no grounds for supposing that this incident could prevent us from spending that evening pleasantly. He even said so in a whisper to the passing Peter Ivanovich, suggesting that they get together for a game at Fyodor Vasilyevich's. But Peter Ivanovich was evidently not fated to play vint that evening. This is like rape of the lock. He's not fated to play vint. Praskyovya Fyodorovna, a short, fat woman who, despite all her efforts to achieve the contrary, still broadened from the shoulders down, dressed all in black, her head covered with lace, and with the same strangely raised eyebrows as the lady who had stood facing the coffin, came out of her rooms with the other ladies and accompanying them to the dead man's door said, the service will begin at once. Please go in. Schwartz, bowing indefinitely, stood there, apparently neither accepting nor declining this suggestion. Just kept bowing, waiting for her to turn around. Then Praskovya Fyodorovna, recognizing Peter Ivanovich, sighed, went up close to him, took him by the hand, oh no, and said, I know you were a true friend of Ivan Ilych, and looked at him, expecting some action from him that would correspond to those words. Peter Ivanovich knew that as there he had to cross himself, so here he had to press her hand, sigh, and say, believe me. And so he did. And having done that, he felt that the result achieved was the desired one, that he was moved, and she was moved. Come, while it hasn't started yet. I must talk to you, said the widow. Give me your arm. Peter Ivanovich offered her his arm, and they went to the inner rooms past Schwartz, who winked mournfully at Peter Ivanovich. There goes our vint. It's a card game. Don't complain if we take another partner unless you join us as a fifth when you get free, said his plainful guy. So he's trapped. She's taken him by the arm. There's no escape for him. He's going to have to go through this ritual now. Now, What does she want to talk to him about? Smoke, please, she said in a magnanimous and at the same time broken-hearted voice. And she began to discuss the question of the price of the plot with Sokolov. So I guess the funeral preparations have not been made. He hasn't bought a plot in the cemetery. She's going to have to pay for it, for the funeral. Peter Ivanovich, lighting up with a cigarette, heard her asking in great detail about the prices of various plots and determining which should be taken. Besides that, having finished about the plot, she also gave orders about the choir. Sokolov left. I do everything myself, she said to Peter Ivanovich, pushing aside the albums that lay on the table, and noticing that the table was threatened with ashes, she promptly moved an ashtray for Peter Ivanovich and said, I find it false to claim that grief prevents me from concerning myself with practical matters. On the contrary, if anything can not comfort but distract me, it is my troubles over him. She took out her handkerchief again as if she was about to cry, but suddenly, as if coming herself, gave it a shake and began to speak calmly. However, I have business with you. Peter Ivanovich bowed, not allowing the springs of the poof, because he just sat on the couch, which at once began stirring under him to act up, because these are an old couch, they're springs, and they make noise, they're squeaky. He doesn't want to squeak up as he gets up. That would be unbecoming. It's a comic scene, in case you can get. During the last days, he suffered terribly. He suffered very much? Asked Peter Ivanovich. Terribly. The last, not minutes, but hours, he didn't stop screaming. For 3 days in a row, he screamed incessantly. It was unbearable. I can't understand how I endured it. It could be heard through 3 doors. What I have endured. Now, what do you get from this? Of course. And the unendurable suffering of her husband was dealt with by closing the door and another door and going as far away in the house as she possibly could from him. So she distanced herself from the suffering. Right. And can it be that he was conscious? Asked Peter Ivanovich. Yes, she whispered, till the last moment. He said farewell to us a quarter of an hour before he died. And I also asked that Volodya be taken away. The thought of the suffering of a man he had known so closely, first as a merry boy, a schoolmate, then as an adult colleague, despite the unpleasant awareness of his own and this woman's falsity, suddenly terrified Peter Ivanovich. He again saw that forehead, the dead man, the nose pressing on the upper lip, and he felt afraid for himself. 3 days of terrible suffering, and then death. Why, that could come for me too, right now, any minute, he thought. And he was momentarily afraid. But at once, he did not know how himself, the usual thought came to his aid, that this had happened to Ivan Ilych and not to him, and that it should and could not happen to him, and that in thinking so, he had succumbed to a gloomy mood, which ought not to be done, as was obvious from Schwarz's face. And having reasoned thus, Peter Ivanovich calmed down and began asking with interest about the details of Ivan Ilych's end, as if death was an occurrence proper only to Ivan Ilych, but not at all to him. So he comes close to thinking about its application to him, but then scurries away rather quickly and thinks happy thoughts, sings the circle of life in his head, and moves on. Now, after various discussions of the details of the truly terrible physical suffering endured by Ivan Ilych, these details Peter Ivanovich learned only by the effect of Ivan Ilych's suffering on Praskovia Fedorovna's nerves, the widow evidently found it necessary to proceed to business. Oh, Peter Ivanovich, it's so hard, so terribly hard, so terribly hard. And she began to cry again. Peter Ivanovich sighed and waited while she blew her nose. When she finished blowing her nose, he said, Believe me. And again, she fell to talking and told him what was evidently her main business with him. This business consisted in the question of how to obtain money from the treasury on the occasion of her husband's death. She made it seem that she was asking Peter Ivanovich's advice about a pension, but he knew that she already knew in the minutest detail things that he did not know, such as all that could be squeezed out of the treasury on the occasion of his death, but that she would like to find out whether it was not possible somehow to squeeze out more. Peter Ivanovich tried to think of some way, but having thought a little, and for decency's sake, having scolded our government for its stinginess, he said it seemed that more was impossible. Then she sighed and obviously began thinking up some way to get rid of her visitor. He understood that, put out his cigarette, got up, pressed her hand, and went to the front hall. In the dining room with the clock that Ivan Ilych was so happy to have brought into the antiques shop, Peter Ivanovich met a priest and several more acquaintances who had come for the service, and noticed a beautiful young lady of his acquaintance, Ivan Ilych's daughter. She was all in black. Her waist, which was very slender, seemed more slender still. She had a gloomy, resolute, almost wrathful look. She bowed to him as if he were to blame for something. Beyond the daughter, with the same offended look, stood a rich young man, Peter Ivanovich's acquaintance, and an examining magistrate, her fiancé, as she had heard. They're both angry. Why are they angry? They don't want to think about this again. It's offensive. The wealthier you are, the angrier you get are at death, by the way. The angrier. He bowed to them dolefully and was about to go into the dead man's room when from under the stairs appeared the little figure of Ivan Ilych's schoolboy son, who looked terribly like him. He was a little Ivan Ilych, as Peter Ivanovich remembered him from law school. His eyes were tearful, and such as are found in impure boys of 13 or 15. 14 rather. Impure boys. What does he mean by impure boys? He's not yet been purified of his affections for his father. He hasn't learned to abstract himself from this and play the game and think about himself. In other words, he's attached to his family and his relations. From the perspective of Peter Ivanovich, this renders him impure. Purity means thinking and acting more like him. Here's a young boy who's devastated by his father's loss. He's the only one. The boy, noticing Peter Ivanovich, began to scowl sternly and bashfully. Peter Ivanovich nodded to him and went into the dead man's room. The service began. Candles, moans, incense, tears, sobs. Peter Ivanovich stood frowning, looking at the feet in front of him. He did not glance once at the dead man, and throughout did not succumb to weakening influence, and was one of the first to leave. There was no one in the front hall. Gerasim, the butler's helper, sprang out of the dead man's room, rummaged with his strong hands through all the fur coats to find Peter Ivanovich's coat, and held it for him. Well, brother Gerasim, a pity, isn't it? It's God's will, said Gerasim. We'll all come to it someday, said Gerasim, baring his white, even row of muzzik's teeth, in other words, a commoner, like a man in the heat of hard work, etc. This figure, Gerasim, we're going to see, was the man who stayed with Peter or Ivan Ilych when he was sick. He acted as a nurse to him. He held Ivan Ilych's legs on his shoulders, just like a woman about to give birth will. You put the stirrups, because it gave him relief. I'll talk more about that when it comes to it. But Gerasim, I don't know if the name has any connotations for you. Does it remind you of any biblical character? It won't necessarily. The demoniac at Gerasim, that is mad and naked, and and chained. And Jesus comes along and casts the demons that are in him. And he's asked what his name is, and his name is Legion, for we are many. And Jesus casts the evil spirits, the demons, into the pigs, and the pigs rush down the water and drown. And the town wants to go after Jesus because the pigs were worth money. Go away from that story. But the Gerasene demoniac is somebody who's possessed and is not of sound mind. Now, from the perspective of everyone in the story, Gerasene, who believes in God and God's will, is crazy. From the perspective of Tolstoy, he is the hero of the story. He's somebody that looks at life in the proper way and understands that death happens in accordance with God's plans. It happens when God wants, and it happens to everyone. He's the one clear-sighted figure here, and he has compassion for Ivan Ilych, whom he does not know otherwise. And he stays with him in his sufferings right till the end. And actually, his willingness to stay with him in his suffering has an effect, a profound effect on Ivan Ilych, which is that Ivan Ilych undergoes something like a new birth. We'll talk about that next time. But there's a vision that he has of falling into a black sack. And what the black sack connotes is an interesting question. But he doesn't want to fall into the black sack. He resists it. And it's one of the questions of this novella is what is the black sack? What does it mean? It suggests death, obviously. But is there more to that? Because he doesn't want to go into it, and then he actually pushes his way through the black sack, and there's light on the other side. As I say, Tolstoy is not necessarily a Christian. In fact, most people don't think that he is. But what we get here in this portrait, and I've just read chapter 1, I'm going to finish with chapter 1, is two kinds of life. So there is death, and there's a commonality of the death. But there's two ways of responding to death. One is there's a sort of an artificial life, a life that is constructed by society that allows them to insulate themselves from thinking about death and live their lives accordingly. And they all follow the rules for that. It's the social conventions. And they want to be part of the in crowd. And if you want to climb the corporate ladder and you want to live in Moscow and live with the happy, shiny people, then you will not talk about those things. On the other hand, there's a man who lives an authentic life, Gerasim, and eventually Ivan Ilych, who recognizes that death and the way we approach it is part of the meaning and significance of life. So there's a contrast being made here. But remember, from the perspective of the society in general, Gerasim is the crazy one. From the perspective of Tolstoy, it's everyone else that's crazy. And so he presents him as a foil for the other characters. So there are two types of living. There's this one man who's just a commoner who gives his life to alleviate or to palliate some of the sufferings of the people around him, and he acts as a servant. Everybody else wants to be lordly and have others serve them. It's a really interesting story, and it's a compelling story. If you haven't read it thus far, read it. It's a transformative story in many ways. It's one of the brilliant works of Western literature, and you can see the influence of Christian thought in it for sure. This could not have been written by a Hindu. It wouldn't have the same view of life and death, the meaning of life. It wouldn't have personal significance. It could not have been written by a Enlightenment thinker. Could not have been written by an Enlightenment thinker. Simply couldn't. It could not have been written by a nihilist like Nietzsche, who thinks that there's no meaning and purpose to life. That all of life is vanity, like Ecclesiastes presents it. That's one of the teachings of wisdom literature, that life is vanity, it's meaningless. If you're a nihilist, which most people in the 20th centuries are, you could not have written this work. Because Tolstoy thinks that there is meaning in death. And there's more to life than is suggested by a death. And that is because there's a sense of life after the death. And again, it's a particular cultural artifact written by a Russian novelist, which I think still is powerful and brilliant. And I hope you enjoy it. And I'll finish with that. Any comments or questions, by the way? Yes?
I just Googled the name of the servant. It actually means honorable elder.
Honorable elder, even. Okay.
Which would make sense.
It would.
He's the one guy.
He's the one honorable, but he's the servant, and nobody regards him. And he does what nobody wants to do. Even the wife doesn't want anything to do with the kids. Like everybody's estranged from this poor man, who they all liked. They all liked. This is not a bad man that he's like. Everyone liked and admired him, and yet nobody wants to or cares about him, and they don't care about each other either. So it's a brilliant portrait of the way in which modern society is lived. Right? Thank you.